The rain in Gloucester, Massachusetts, didn't just fall. It haunted. It was a cold, salt-heavy mist that clung to the gray stone walls of St. Jude's Cathedral, turning the morning of my father's funeral into a landscape of charcoal and slate inside. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax candles and the damp wool of heavy overcoats. My name is Nathan Sterling. Most people call me Nate. To the world, I am the man who manages the city's aging bones, the sewers, the bridges, the things people only think about when they break. But today, I was just a son standing next to a closed mahogany casket that held Arthur Sterling, a man who had lived 82 years and died with a hammer still in his toolbox. I stood in the front pew, my hand interlaced with Clara's. Her grip was the only thing keeping me anchored. Clara didn't wear designer labels or diamonds that caught the light. She wore a simple charcoal coat and a look of profound, quiet strength. She didn't need to fill the silence with chatter. She knew that grief was a heavy coat you had to wear alone sometimes, even when someone was standing right next to you. The church was filled with the rhythmic sounds of mourning, the soft creak of old wooden pews, the muffled coughs, the rustle of prayer books. My mother sat 2 seats away, her frame looking smaller than I had ever remembered. She stared at the altar as if she were waiting for a different ending to the story. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral groaned open. A draft of freezing Atlantic air swept down the center aisle, carrying with it a scent that didn't belong in a church. It was the scent of Italian leather and a perfume so sharp and expensive. It felt like a physical intrusion. Julian walked in first, my brother. He didn't walk like a man in mourning. He walked like a man who had just bought the building and was checking the acoustics. At 58, Julian was a strategic architect for global tech firms, a title that changed every time he got a new business card. He was draped in a bespoke suit that cost more than my annual mortgage payments, and his shoes clicked against the marble floor with a precision that demanded attention. And on his arm was Sienna Vance, 9 years. It had been 9 years since she walked out of my life, taking the light with her and leaving behind a pile of unpaid bills and a shattered ego. She was 52 now, but she had aged like a polished statue. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, effortless knot, and her lips were painted the color of a bruised plum. She looked around the cathedral with a faint air of boredom, as if the grief of ordinary people was a play she had seen too many times. As they reached our pew, the service hadn't yet begun. The whispers began to ripple through the congregation, like a tide hitting the shore. "That's Julian. I heard he just closed a deal in Singapore. Is that the girl who was with Nate? What is she doing with his brother?" The old, familiar knot of inadequacy tightened in my chest. It was the ghost of the man I used to be, the man who felt small in the presence of shiny things. I felt the heat rise in my neck, the instinct to look at the floor. But then, I felt Clara's thumb rub gently against the back of my hand, a simple, grounding gesture. I didn't look down. I looked straight ahead. Julian stopped in front of me. He didn't offer a hug. He offered a firm, professional handshake, the kind you give a junior associate. "Nate," he whispered, his voice smooth and devoid of any real tremor. "Good of you to handle the arrangements. Mom looks tired. She's grieving." "Julian," I said, my voice level. "It's what people do when they lose someone they love." Julian's jaw tightened slightly, but his smile didn't fade. He was a master of the mask, right? Of course. Then Sienna stepped forward. The scent of her perfume, the same one she wore the night she left, hit me like a blow to the stomach. She leaned in close, her eyes scanning Clara for a split second, dismissing her with a single glance, before settling on me. She leaned toward my ear. Her breath was warm, but her words were ice. "So," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic taunt. "I guess I won, right? You're still exactly where I left you. Still poor. Still Nate." She pulled back, a tiny, satisfied smirk playing at the corner of her mouth, the same look she had when she left my engagement ring on a grease-stained kitchen counter. I didn't flinch. I didn't snap back with a clever insult. 9 years ago, that sentence would have leveled me. It would have sent me into a spiral of self-loathing that lasted months. But today, standing in the dim light of St. Jude's, I looked at her and felt something I didn't expect. I felt pity. "The service is starting," I said quietly. Turning my gaze back to the priest, Julian and Sienna slid into the pew behind us. Throughout the liturgy, I could hear the faint vibration of Julian's phone. He wasn't praying. He was checking stock tickers. He was impatient for the dead to be buried, so he could get back to the living business of making money. I watched the priest's lips move, hearing words about dust and glory. But my mind was drifting back to the first time the ground cracked. Beneath my feet, I was thinking about the engagement dinner in Boston 9 years ago, when the person I trusted most in the world started looking at my brother the way a starving person looks at a feast. Sienna thought she had won because she had the gold-plated life. She didn't realize that I had spent the last 9 years building something. She couldn't even see a life made of stone and truth, rather than glass and ego. As the choir began the opening hymn, the sound filled the rafters, drowning out the whispers. I closed my eyes and whispered a silent goodbye to my father, knowing that the real battle today wasn't at the casket. It was in the fellowship hall that would follow, where the masks would finally start to slip. The reception was held in the parish hall, a basement room with low ceilings, fluorescent lights that hummed with a nervous energy, and the faint, lingering smell of floor wax and overboiled coffee. This was the fellowship after the Sorrowa tradition of the working class in Gloucester. You didn't go home to hide. You stood in a crowded room with a paper plate and a lukewarm drink, and you let the community's stories patch the holes in your heart. Clara and I stood near the back of the room, close to where my mother sat in a folding chair. She was surrounded by a fortress of elderly women who brought her tissues and spoke in hushed, rhythmic tones. "You okay?" Clara asked, her eyes searching mine. She had a way of reading the micro-movements of my face that always unnerved and comforted me at the same time. "I'm fine," I said, though the back of my neck felt tight, just waiting for the performance to begin. I didn't have to wait long. The double doors swung open, and Julian and Sienna entered. They didn't just walk into the room, they altered the atmosphere. The hum of conversation dipped for a second, then rose back up in a different key, sharper, more curious. Julian had shed his overcoat, revealing a charcoal silk vest that hugged his frame perfectly. He began to move through the room like a politician. On the eve of an election, he didn't wait for people to come to him. He went to them, clasping hands, patting shoulders, projecting a version of grief that looked like it belonged in a luxury watch. Commercial. Sienna stayed by his side, her movements fluid and predatory. She held a glass of water like it was a flute of champagne, her eyes scanning the room with a practiced, judgmental gaze. Every few seconds, her eyes would land on me, then flick away, as if she were checking a clock she expected to stop. "Look at them," I whispered to Clara. "It's like they're scouting a location for a boutique hotel, not attending a funeral. They're performing, Nate," Clara replied softly. "People who are empty inside always need a loud audience to feel full." The crowd began to split. The older generation, the men who had worked on the docks or in the local hardware stores with my father, gravitated toward me. They offered calloused hands and stories about how my dad had fixed their engines or lent them tools without asking for them back. But the younger, more ambitious crowd, the local business owners and real estate agents, gravitated toward Julian. They wanted to breathe the same air as a strategic architect from the city. I watched as Julian cornered the local councilman near the coffee urns. He was talking fast, his hands gesturing toward the ceiling. I could catch snippets of words, like leverage, venture capital, and market disruption. At a funeral for a man who spent his life building physical, honest things, Julian was selling invisible dreams. Sienna, bored with the talk of local politics, began to drift toward us. She walked slowly, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm on the linoleum. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes raking over the catering table, the store-bought cookies and the tuna sandwiches, with the crusts cut off. "This is also nostalgic," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by those standing nearby. "It reminds me of why I had to leave this town. It's like a time capsule of stagnant dreams." Clara stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a quiet dignity that forced Sienna to actually look at her. "It's a room full of people who loved Arthur," Clara said. "In this town, we value the person over the menu. Sienna's eyes narrowed. She took a slow sip of her water, looking Clara up and down. And you are? I'm Clara, Nathan's wife, Sienna. Let out a dry, musical laugh, right? The wife. Nathan was always good at finding things that were reliable, sturdy, like a good pair of work boots. She turned her gaze to me. I see you haven't changed, Nate. Still surrounding yourself with things that don't challenge you. I'm not interested in being challenged by my life anymore, Sienna, I said. I'm interested in living it. Living it. She stepped closer. The smell of her perfume white lilies, and something metallic filling my space. You call this living? Counting pennies in a town that's sinking into the Atlantic? Julian is about to take his firm public. We have a place in the seaport and a house in the vineyard. That's living. This. She gestured to the room. This is just waiting to die. Before I could answer, a tall, well-built man in a navy blazer approached us. He had a weathered face and sharp, intelligent eyes. It was Elias Thorne, the head of the Regional Transit Authority and one of the most respected figures in the state's infrastructure circle. Nathan, Elias said, ignoring Sienna and Julian entirely. He gripped my hand with a strength that felt like an endorsement. I was hoping to find you here. I wanted to pay my respects to your father, but I also wanted to thank you personally. I saw Julian freeze in the middle of his conversation nearby. His head turned toward us for what? Elias asked. The bridge project in the North Corridor, Elias said, his voice loud enough to carry. Everyone else wanted the flashy, expensive fix that would have looked great for 2 years and crumbled in 5. You stayed firm on the structural repairs. You saved the city $12 million and ensured that bridge will stand for another 50 years. My board is voting next week to bring you on as the lead consultant for the regional revitalization project. The room went momentarily still. Sienna's smirk didn't just fade, it vanished. Julian took a half step toward us, his face a mask of confusion. Nate? Julian asked, his voice cracking just a hair. You're working with the RTA? I thought you were just a city maintenance guy. Elias Thorne looked at Julian with the same indifference one might show a stray cat. Nathan Sterling is the reason this region's bones aren't breaking. Mr. Sterling. He builds things that last. That's a lot harder than building things that just look good on a balance sheet. Elias patted me on the shoulder. I'll call you Monday, Nate. We have a lot to talk about. As Elias walked away, the air in the room shifted. The elite who had been hovering around Julian were now looking at me with new eyes. They weren't seeing the poor brother anymore. They were seeing the man who held the keys to the next decade of the region's growth. Sienna stood there, her glass of water trembling slightly in her hand. The victory she had claimed in the church, the one she had whispered into my ear, was starting to look like a hollow prize. I looked at her, then at Julian. You were saying something about stagnant dreams, I asked quietly. Julian's jaw flexed. He reached for his phone, a reflex he used whenever he felt he was losing a room. We should go. Sienna, we have a dinner in the city, but the service isn't even over, I said. And you haven't even said goodbye to Mom. She's busy, Julian snapped, turning on his heel as they walked toward the door. Their departure felt less like a grand exit and more like a retreat. I looked down at Clara, who was smiling, not a smile of triumph, but one of peace. The performance is over, she whispered. No, I said, watching the heavy doors close behind them. It's just the intermission. We haven't even gotten to the part where they realize what they really lost. The human mind has a cruel way of preserving trauma in high definition. As the doors of the fellowship hall clicked shut behind Julian and Sienna, the sound echoed in my mind, transforming into the sound of a different door, a heavy, stained oak door of a high-end Italian restaurant in Boston's North End. 9 years ago. At 45, I thought I had finally reached the summit. I was a senior engineer for the city. My bank account was stable, and I had a woman on my arm who made people stop and stare. Sienna Vance was a whirlwind of ambition and sharp angles. We had been dating for 2 years, and I had spent 6 months worth of savings on a diamond that felt like a milestone. I remember the engagement dinner vividly. The air in the restaurant was thick with the smell of roasted garlic, expensive red wine, and the overconfidence of the wealthy. My father, Arthur, had put on his only suit, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and old age. My mother was beaming. And then there was Julian. Julian had arrived late, as always. He didn't just enter a room. He staged an arrival. He was 34. Then, riding the first massive wave of the tech consulting boom, he sat down, ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than my first car, and immediately began to suck the oxygen out of the conversation. "So, Nate," Julian had said, swirling the dark liquid in his glass, "still working on the drainage systems, still making sure the rain goes where it's supposed to. It's important work, Julian," my father had interrupted, though his voice lacked conviction. Julian had laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Important. Sure, but is it impactful? The world is moving toward the cloud, and my brother is still buried in the dirt." I had looked at Sienna then, expecting her to jump to my defense. We were a team. We were building a life. But she wasn't looking at me. She was watching Julian. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the candlelight and the predatory gleam in my brother's expression. She wasn't just listening to him. She was inhaling him. "The cloud sounds fascinating, Julian," Sienna had whispered. It was the first time I heard that specific tone in her voice, the tone of a woman who had just realized she was holding a silver coin when she could have had a gold bar. That night, after we went back to the apartment we shared, the silence was different. It wasn't the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's hearts. It was a cold, clinical silence. "Your brother is very driven," Sienna had said as she sat at her vanity, removing her earrings. "He's loud, Sienna. There's a difference, is there?" She turned to look at me, her face pale in the mirror's glow. "He talks about the future like he owns it. You talk about the city's budget like it's a prayer book. Don't you want more, Nate? Don't you want to be the person people lean toward instead of the person they walk over? I'm an engineer, not a salesman. I build things that stay upright." She had turned back to the mirror then, and I realized, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that she was already gone. I was just the last person to know. The weeks that followed were a slow-motion car crash. My brother started dropping by when he knew I was at the city council meetings. Sienna started having networking dinners that ran until 2 in the morning. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that loyalty was a real thing, that my own flesh and blood wouldn't reach into my chest and pull my heart out just because he could. Then came the night of the storm. A massive nor'easter was battering the coast. I was out in the mud and the dark, supervising an emergency crew at a failing pump station. My phone was dead. My boots were soaked. My mind was focused on preventing 100 basements from flooding. When I finally climbed into my truck at 4 a.m., exhausted and shivering, all I wanted was the warmth of my home and the sight of the woman I loved. When I walked into the apartment, the air felt wrong. It was too quiet. The scent of her perfume, that sharp, metallic floral, was heavy in the hallway. I walked into the kitchen and saw it. The ring dot, it was sitting on the granite counter, right next to a half-empty glass of expensive wine. No note. Just the ring. It looked small and pathetic under the fluorescent light. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Julian. "Don't be bitter, little brother. It's just business. She needs a bigger stage, and I'm the only one who can build it for her. I'll send someone for her things tomorrow." I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I sat down on the kitchen floor, still in my muddy work clothes, and I stared at that ring until the sun came up. I realized then that my father had been right. People like Julian didn't see people. They saw assets, and people like Sienna didn't see love. They saw an investment. I was 45 years old, and I was a bad investment. Standing now in the fellowship hall, 9 years later, the ghost of that night tried to claw its way back up my throat. I looked at the coffee urns, the paper plates, and the grieving faces of my neighbors. "Nate," Clara's voice broke the trance. She was standing beside me, her hand resting on my arm. She didn't ask what I was thinking. She already knew. "I'm okay," I said. And for the first time in nearly a decade, I realized I wasn't lying. The old wound was still there, a jagged scar on my soul, but it didn't hurt anymore. Because while Julian and Sienna had spent 9 years trying to stay on top of a mountain made of sand, I had spent 9 years building a foundation on the rock. I looked at Clara, then toward the door where my brother had disappeared. The poor brother was the only one in the room who didn't have to look over his shoulder to see if someone was catching up. "Let's go check on Mom," I said. "And then, I want to tell you about that bridge project. I think we're going to need a lot more stone than we thought." The silence that followed Julian and Sienna's departure was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of recalibration. In a small town like Gloucester, reputation is a currency that trades slowly, but when it moves like an avalanche. I stood by the long table of untouched casseroles, feeling the eyes of the room shifting. For years, I had been the other Sterling, the one who stayed behind, the one who worked for the city, the one whose wife had left him for his more successful brother. But as Elias Thorne's words settled into the rafters of the parish hall, that old identity began to dissolve. Tom Reyes, a man I had known for 20 years, a retired contractor, with hands as rough as tree bark, walked up to me. He didn't look at me with the pity he usually reserved for our encounters. He looked at me with a sharp, newfound curiosity. "Lead consultant for the North Corridor, Nate?" Tom asked, his voice gravelly. "That's a hell of a seat to sit in." I heard the big firms in Boston were clawing each other's eyes out for that contract. "They were," I said, taking a sip of the lukewarm coffee, "but they were selling flash. They wanted to build a glass and steel monstrosity that would look great on a brochure, but wouldn't survive a decade of salt spray and nor'easters. And I told them the truth," I replied. "I told them that if they didn't fix the pilings first, the whole thing was a waste of taxpayer money." "I guess Thorne prefers the truth over a sales pitch." Tom nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. "Your father would have got a kick out of that. He always said a house is only as good as the hole you dig for it." As Tom moved off, others began to approach. It was a strange, silent procession of respect. The local baker, the librarian, even the young real estate agents who had previously been hovering around Julian's expensive cologne. They weren't asking for favors yet. They were just acknowledging that the map of the town had changed. I looked across the room and saw Clara. She was sitting with my mother, holding her hand while my mother wept not for the loss of my father, but perhaps for the realization of the sons she had raised. My mother had spent decades defending Julian's ambition to the neighbors, excusing his absence at Christmas and birthdays because he was changing the world. Now, she was watching the brother who stayed become the man the world actually relied on. "Nate," a voice called out. I turned to see Sarah Jenkins, a reporter for the local Chronicle. She had her notebook out, though she wasn't writing yet. "Is it true? About the East Mulberry project too? I heard you've been quietly buying up the derelict warehouses near the docks through an LLC. I paused. I hadn't wanted that news out. Yet, I'm looking at stabilizing the area, Sarah, not gentrifying it. There's a difference. People are saying you're the one who convinced the board to keep the low-income housing quotas, that you turned down a massive buyout from a developer out of New York. New York developers don't have to live here when the foundations crack," I said. "I do." She scribbled something down, her eyes bright. "Julian didn't look too happy about the news." "Julian lives in a world where the loudest person wins," I said. "In my world, the person who's still standing at the end of the storm wins." The atmosphere in the hall was warming up, but not from the heaters. It was the warmth of a community closing ranks. I realized that for 9 years, I had carried the shame of being left behind like a lead weight in my pocket. I had let Sienna's whispered "you're still poor" define my internal monologue. But looking around this room, I saw the truth. Wealth wasn't the car Julian had parked crookedly outside. It wasn't the plum-colored lipstick on Sienna's mocking mouth. Wealth was the fact that when I walked through this town, people didn't just know my name. They trusted my work. I walked over to my mother and Clara. My mother looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Nathan," she whispered. "Elias, he said your father would be proud." "I hope so, Mom. He was a hard man," she said, her voice shaking. "He didn't know how to tell you that he saw what you were doing. He thought if he pushed you, you'd become like Julian. He didn't realize that being like you was the harder thing to do." I knelt beside her, feeling the cold linoleum through my trousers. "It's okay, Mom. I didn't do it for him. I did it because someone has to make sure the bridges don't fall. Clara put her hand on my shoulder, and I felt a surge of gratitude so sharp it almost hurt. She had known who I was when I was just a man with a duplex and a dream of stable drainage. She had loved the poor version of Nate Sterling, which made the successful version feel like a shared victory. Outside, the rain began to turn to sleet, tapping against the high, thin windows of the parish hall. It was the sound of the world testing the structure. I stood up, feeling taller than I had in a decade. Julian was somewhere out there, likely screaming into a phone in a car that cost more than a house, trying to figure out how he had lost the lead in his own family's story. And Sienna was likely beside him, realizing that the safe man she had discarded was now the only one. With solid ground beneath his feet, ready to go, Clara asked. Almost, I said. I just want to say one more thing to the priest. I walked to the front of the room where Father O'Malley was packing up the leftover communion wafers. Father, I said, the roof on the rectory. I noticed the flashing was loose when we walked in. Send the bill to Whitmore Urban Works. We'll take care of it. The priest smiled, a knowing, tired smile. God bless you, Nathan. You always were one for the details. The details are all we have, Father, I said. Everything else is just noise. If the funeral was the burial of my father, this memory was the burial of my innocence. 9 years ago, Boston was experiencing a heat wave that turned the brick corridors of the city into an oven. I was 45, and I was happy, or at least, I was the version of happy that a man is before he discovers his foundation is made of salt. I had just finished a grueling 16-hour shift inspecting the old subway tunnels. Under the harbor, I was covered in the dust of a century. My back ached, but I had a velvet box in my pocket. Sienna was waiting at our apartment in Beacon Hill, a place that was slightly beyond my means. But I had pushed myself to afford it because she said the energy of the neighborhood matched her career trajectory. You're late, Nate, she had said that evening, not looking up from her laptop. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair perfectly coiffed for a Tuesday night. The tunnels don't care about the clock, Sienna, I replied, dropping my boots by the door. But I have something to make up for it. When I knelt and opened that box, the expression on her face wasn't joy. It was a brief flicker of calculation, as if she were checking the size of the stone against a mental list of her own worth. She said yes. Eventually, we drank cheap sparkling wine, and for a few weeks, I lived in a beautiful lie. The great betrayal began 2 months later at my brother Julian's 35th birthday party. Julian had rented out the penthouse of a glass tower overlooking the Charles River. The guest list was a who's who of people who used the word disruption as a personality trait. I felt like a ghost in the room, dressed in a suit that was a season behind, holding a beer while everyone else sipped cocktails with names I couldn't pronounce. I remember standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the lights of the city. Sienna was across the room, leaning into a conversation with Julian. The way she was looking at him, it was a look she had stopped giving me months ago. It was hunger. Your brother has a gift, Nate, my father had said, appearing at my elbow. He was nursing a scotch, looking around the penthouse with a mixture of awe and resentment. He sees the cracks in the world before they happen. He's a hunter. And what am I, Dad? I asked, my voice tight. You're the gardener, he said, not looking at me. You're steady. But gardens don't make headlines. Later that night, the air on the balcony was thick and humid. I had gone out to catch my breath when I heard voices from the shadows. He's a good man, Julian, I heard Sienna say. Her voice was different, soft, pleading, almost desperate. But he's heavy. He thinks in decades. I want to live in the minutes. Nate is a relic, Julian's voice replied. It was smooth, like expensive bourbon, and completely devoid of brotherly love. He's the man who builds the road so people like me can drive over it in a Ferrari. You don't belong on the sidewalk, Sienna. You belong in the car. I stood frozen. The city lights blurred. I should have walked out then. I should have confronted them. But my father's words, gardens don't make headlines, felt like a lead weight in my gut. I stayed quiet. I stayed invisible. The actual break happened on a rainy Tuesday, 3 weeks before the wedding. I had come home early. The apartment was dark except for the glow of a single lamp in the bedroom. I heard her crying. For a second, my heart broke for her. I thought she was overwhelmed with the wedding plans. Or perhaps she was sick. I walked to the door, ready to comfort her, ready to tell her that we didn't need the big house or the fancy life. Then I heard her on the phone. "I can't do it, Julian," she sobbed. "I can't marry him knowing what I know now. Every time he talks about our steady future, I feel like I'm being buried alive. He's so proud of that pension. And all I can think about is how many years I have to wait before I'm allowed to be happy." There was a pause. She must have been listening to him. Then she laughed a wet, bitter sound. "You're right," she said. "He won't even be angry. He'll just be disappointed. That's his favorite emotion. He'll probably just offer to help me pack." I didn't offer to help her pack. I walked into the room, and the look of sheer, naked terror on her face was almost enough to make me feel guilty. She dropped the phone. It clattered on the hardwood, the screen cracked. A jagged spiderweb over Julian's contact name. "Nate," she whispered. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough to know that the gardener is being replaced by the hunter," I said. My voice was surprisingly calm. It was the calmness of a man who has just seen a bridge collapse and is already calculating the debris. "It's not what you think," she started. "The classic lie of the guilty." "It's exactly what I think," I replied. "You want the headlines, Sienna. You want the Ferrari. And Julian just wants to take the one thing I have that he couldn't buy." She stood up, her face hardening. The tears dried instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. "He didn't take me, Nate. I chose him. Because when I look at you, I see a life of maintenance. When I look at him, I see a life of creation. He doesn't create anything, Sienna," I said. "He moves numbers around. He sells smoke. And eventually, the wind blows the smoke away." "Well," she said, reaching for her suitcase that was already half packed in the closet, "at least with smoke, you can breathe. With you, I'm just suffocating under the weight of reliable." She left that night. She didn't even take all her shoes. She left the engagement ring on the counter not because she felt bad, but because Julian had already promised her a bigger one. As I stood in the dark apartment, listening to the rain hit the windows, I realized that the betrayal wasn't just about a woman or a brother. It was about the realization that in the world of the Sterlings, I was the only one who believed that staying was harder than leaving. Standing now in the present, at my father's funeral, I realized that Sienna was still running. She was 52, and she was still chasing the minutes, still trying to prove that her choice had been the right one. I looked at the ring on Clara's finger, a modest, beautiful band we had chosen together. It didn't represent a bad investment. It represented a covenant. I turned away from the memory, back to the reality of the cold, damp parish hall. The heavy brother was the only one who wasn't sinking. The 6 months following the night Sienna left were a blur of gray light and mechanical movement. I lived in a state of high-functioning shock. I would wake up at 5 a.m., my heart hammering against my ribs before I even remembered why I was sad. Then the memory would rush in the cracked phone screen, the smell of her perfume, the casual cruelty of my brother's text. I became a ghost in my own life. I moved through the city offices like a shadow. My colleagues at the engineering department spoke to me in hushed, pitying tones, the way people talk to someone with a terminal diagnosis. "You look tired, Nate," my supervisor, a man named Henderson, said one afternoon. He was looking at the drainage reports I'd submitted. They were perfect, but they lacked the usual detail, the extra care I used to put into the margins. "I am tired, Henderson," I said, "but the pipes don't care if I've slept. Take some time off. Go to the Cape, clear your head." I didn't go to the Cape. I went to the gym. I found a place on the outskirts of Gloucester warehouse with no air conditioning, filled with the smell of rust and old sweat. It was owned by an ex-Marine who didn't care about my family name or my broken heart. I started lifting, not for health, but for the sensation of a physical weight that I could actually move. When I held a 100-pound dumbbell, the world made sense. Gravity was a law that didn't lie. Unlike Sienna, gravity was honest. But the real breaking point, the moment the old Nate died and the new Nate was born, happened on a Tuesday in November. I was at my father's house. He was sitting in his recliner, the television blaring a news report about the tech sector. Julian had been interviewed for a segment on the future of infrastructure, and his face tan, smug, and successful filled the screen. "He's got the spark," my father muttered, his eyes fixed on the TV. Julian always knew how to catch the wind. I stood in the doorway, a bag of groceries in my hands. "He's talking about private equity for toll roads, Dad. He's talking about selling the public's property back to them for a profit. He's making a name for himself," my father snapped, finally looking at me. "Well, what are you doing? You're still digging holes for the city. You let that girl walk out the door because you couldn't give her a reason to stay. You're 45, Nathan. If you haven't made your move by now, you're just part of the scenery." That was the snap. It wasn't a loud explosion. It was the quiet sound of a final thread snapping in a cable. I set the groceries on the counter, walked over to the TV, and turned it off. "I am the scenery, Dad," I said, my voice dangerously low. "I'm the ground you're sitting on. I'm the roof over your head. And from now on, I'm not doing it because I want your approval. I'm doing it because I'm the only one who knows how to keep it from falling down." I walked out of that house and drove until I reached the edge of a derelict industrial park. Near the North Corridor, it was a wasteland of cracked asphalt and rusted fences. I got out of the car and stood in the rain, looking at a crumbling brick warehouse that had been abandoned since the 70s. Everyone else saw trash. I saw the bones. I went back to my apartment and took every document I had regarding my pension, my savings, and my small inheritance from my grandmother. I spent the next 3 nights without sleep, running numbers on a spreadsheet that would have made a banker weep. I was going to buy that warehouse. I was going to fix it. And I was going to do it without a single dollar of Julian's venture capital. That was the birth of Sterling Urban Works. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell my father. I certainly didn't tell Julian. I worked my city job from 7 o'clock to 4 o'clock, and from 5 o'clock to midnight. I was at that warehouse. I did the demolition myself. I tore out the lead pipes with my own hands. I scraped the rust off the steel beams until my knuckles bled. One night, round to a.m., I was sitting on a bucket of joint compound, my head in my hands. The building was cold. The electricity was running off a single humming generator, and I felt utterly, completely alone. I thought about Sienna and her penthouse, probably drinking champagne and laughing at a joke Julian just told. I thought about how easy it would be to just quit, to sell the lot, take the loss, and go back to being steady Nate. I looked up at the ceiling. I had just finished reinforcing the main load-bearing beam. It was straight. It was true. It was stronger than it had been 40 years ago. "This is mine." I whispered to the empty room. "This is real." The loneliness didn't go away, but it changed. It stopped being a hole I was falling into and started being a space I was filling. I stopped looking at my brother's social media. I stopped checking to see if Sienna had posted a photo of her new ring. I deleted their numbers. I began to study the tax codes for opportunity zones. I learned about historical preservation, grants. I realized that my years of working for the city had given me a superpower. I knew the bureaucracy better than the developers did. I knew where the bodies were buried in the zoning office. By the end of the year, I had my first tenant, a small, local tech maker space that couldn't afford the downtown rents. They didn't want disruption. They wanted a floor that didn't sag and a roof that didn't leak. I remember the day they moved in. I stood on the sidewalk, watching them carry in their 3D printers and soldering stations. I felt a sense of pride that was deeper than anything I had felt as a city employee. I hadn't just maintained something. I had resurrected it. That was the breaking point. I hadn't broken down. I had broken out, standing in the funeral hall 9 years later, looking at Julian's expensive suit and Sienna's tired eyes. I realized that they were still living in the minutes. They were still looking for the next surge, the next high. They hadn't learned that the only way to survive the storm is to become the thing. The storm can't move. I felt a hand on my back. "Clara, you're thinking about the warehouse," she said, her voice a warm anchor. "How did you know? You get a certain look in your eyes," she smiled, "like you're checking the structural integrity of the air." "I was just thinking about the night I finished the roof," I said. "I thought I was alone. I didn't know I was just clearing space for you." By the time I hit 48, my life had taken on a rhythm that was entirely my own. The warehouse project hadn't just succeeded, it had become a blueprint. I had acquired 2 more unfixable properties, a former textile mill and a collapsed corner. Grocery. I wasn't just an engineer anymore. I was a developer who spoke the language of the neighborhood. But my personal life was still a construction site cleared of debris, but empty. I met Clara at a zoning board meeting on a rainy Tuesday. In April, I was there to argue for a variance on a low-income housing project I was spearheading in the East End. The room was filled with the usual cast of characters: angry neighbors, board officials, and slick lawyers representing corporate interests. And then there was Clara. She was representing a local nonprofit that focused on workforce housing, homes for the teachers, nurses, and dock workers who were being priced out of Gloucester by people like my brother. She didn't have a flashy PowerPoint. She had a folder of data and a voice that was as steady as a heartbeat. Profit is a metric, she had told the board, her eyes locking onto the chairman's. But stability is a legacy. If we don't build for the people who keep this city running, we're just building a museum for the wealthy. I leaned back in my chair, mesmerized. For years, I had been the only person in the room talking about bones and foundations. Now, here was someone talking about the soul of the structure. After the meeting, I caught up with her in the parking lot. The salter was thick, and the seagulls were screaming over the harbor. That was a hell of a speech, I said, shielding my eyes from the drizzle. She turned, tucking a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. She didn't give me the networking smile I was used to from women in Sienna's circle. She gave me a look of pure, unfiltered assessment. And you're Nathan Sterling, the guy who fixes the sewers and buys the ruins. That's me, I said, the man of the dirt. I like the dirt, she replied. You can't lie to the dirt. It either holds the weight or it doesn't. We went for coffee that night at a diner where the linoleum was peeling, and the coffee was strong enough to peel paint. We didn't talk about disruption or venture capital. We talked about the way the light hits the harbor in October. We talked about why it's harder to save an old building than to tear it down. My brother would hate this place, I said, gesturing to the greasy booth. Your brother is Julian Sterling, right? She asked. I've seen him on the news. He looks like a man who has never had a blister in his life. He hasn't, I said. He pays people to have them for him. And Sienna? She asked it gently, but I felt the old ghost stir. She's with him now. They're a perfect match. They both believe the world is a stage. I just want to be the guy who builds the stage. Clara reached across the table and touched my hand. Her skin was warm, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel the urge to pull away. I don't need a stage, Nate. I just need a place that doesn't leak when it rains. Dating Clara was like coming home after a long deployment. There were no games. There were no tests to see if I was earning enough or moving fast enough. We spent our weekends walking through my properties. She'd look at a floor plan and see a nursery. I'd look at it and see a load-bearing wall. Together, we saw a future. While my life was grounding itself, Julian's was starting to oscillate wildly. I heard rumors through the grapevine his firm had over-leveraged on a series of smart city projects that were failing to gain traction. He was selling off assets. My mother would call me, her voice trembling. Julian sounds stressed. Nathan, he says the market is irrational. He says people don't appreciate vision anymore. Vision doesn't pay the interest on a bridge loan, Mom. I'd say, trying to remain neutral. One afternoon, Julian actually called me. It was the first time we'd spoken in 3 years. Nate, he said, his voice sounding thin, as if it were being squeezed through a wire. I'm looking at some redevelopment. Stats for the North Corridor. Your name keeps popping up. You've got a tidy little portfolio there. I have some properties. Julian, nothing that would interest you. No disruption here. Just bricks. Listen, he said. Ignoring me, I'm putting together a consortium. We're looking to roll up some local holdings into a right. You bring your properties in. I'll give you a seat on the board, and we'll both be looking at a 10 times exit in 5 years. I stood in the middle of my latest project, a 4-unit building that was nearly finished. I looked at the craftsmanship of the molding, the quality of the windows. No, I said. No, Nate, don't be a fool. You're playing in the dirt while I'm offering you the sky. I like the dirt, Julian, and the sky is looking pretty cloudy from where I'm standing. My properties are leased. My tenants are happy. I'm not looking for an exit. I'm looking to stay. The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest sound I'd ever heard from my brother. He hung up without saying goodbye. I married Clara 6 months later. It was a small ceremony at the warehouse, the first one I'd bought. We decorated it with string lights and local wildflowers. My mother was there, looking confused but happy. Julian and Sienna sent a card, a stiff, formal thing with a pre-printed message dot as we danced in the middle of that old building, the smell of sawdust and floor wax in the air. I realized that I had finally won the race I didn't even know I was running. I wasn't poor Nate anymore. I was the man who owned his own time, standing now at the funeral, watching Julian pace by the coffee urns with his phone pressed to his ear. I realized that he was still looking for an exit. He was still trying to find a way to leave his own life. I looked at Clara, who was talking to a retired fisherman about his pension. She looked radiant, not because of her clothes, but because of her presence. He's losing his grip, I whispered as she came back to my side. He never had a grip. Nate, she said softly, he just had a good view. There's a difference. The atmosphere in the fellowship hall had curdled. What began as a somber gathering for my father had turned into a theater of quiet revelations. Julian was still pacing near the back exit, his hushed voice sharp with desperation as he argued with someone on his phone. Sienna stood alone by the cooling coffee urns, her eyes darting around the room as if she were looking for a way to rewrite the script of the afternoon. I was standing with Clara when Sienna finally approached us again. This time, she didn't have the smirk. She had the look of a woman who had spent 9 years running a race, only to find out the finish line had been moved. You really did it, didn't you? She said, her voice low and tight. The quiet projects, the humble engineer act. You were just waiting for a moment like this to make us look like fools. I wasn't waiting for anything, Sienna, I said. I was just working. You're the one who turned a funeral into a scoreboard. She let out a short, bitter laugh. Working. You always loved that word. Julian is working, too. He's trying to save a multi-million-dollar merger right now while you're talking about. What? A bridge in a town nobody cares about. Julian isn't saving a merger, Sienna, I said, stepping closer. He's trying to stop a margin call. I know the firms he works with. I know the projects he's leveraged. The cloud he was living in. It's starting to rain. Her face went pale, the plum-colored lipstick now looking like a bruise against her skin. You don't know anything about his business. I know that he tried to buy my portfolio 6 months ago because he needed the cash flow to hide his losses, I said levelly. He didn't tell you that, did he? Sienna's eyes flickered toward Julian. For a second, I saw the cracks in her foundation. She had traded a life of maintenance for a life of creation, only to realize she was standing in a house of cards. Julian slammed his phone shut and marched over to us. His face was flushed, his expensive tie slightly crooked. The strategic architect was looking a lot like a man trapped in a burning building, Nate. He snapped, ignoring Sienna's questioning look. I need to talk to you. Privately, anything you have to say, you can say in front of Clara and Sienna, I replied. Julian glanced at Clara, his lip curling with a remnant of his old arrogance. Fine. I'm looking at the North Corridor project. Thorne is an old-school bureaucrat. He listens. To you, I need a seat at the table for the redevelopment phase. My firm can handle the branding, the digital integration. No, I interrupted. Don't be a petty child, Nate. This is business. Our father's legacy is in a casket, Julian, I said, my voice rising just enough to draw the attention of the nearby mourners. His legacy was a hardware store and a set of tools he used until his hands bled. He didn't know how to talk about digital integration. He knew how to build a wall that didn't fall down. You've spent your whole life trying to be bigger than this town, and now that your world is shaking, you want to crawl back into the dirt you spent years mocking. The room went silent. Even my mother looked up from her corner. I'm the lead on that project, I continued. And the first rule of my table is that we don't build with smoke. We build with stone. You have no place there, Julian. Not because I'm bitter, but because I don't trust your foundation." Julian looked round the room. He saw the faces of the people he had ignored for decades, the dock workers, the city clerks, the small people. They weren't looking at him with awe anymore. They were looking at him with the same indifference he had shown them. He turned to Sienna, his hand reaching for her arm with a sudden, needy grip. "Let's go. We're wasting our time here." Sienna didn't move immediately. She looked at me, then at the simple, solid life I had built with Clara. She looked at the respect in the eyes of the people surrounding me, a respect she couldn't buy with Julian's venture capital. "You really did win," she whispered, her voice so soft only I could hear it. "I didn't win, Sienna," I said. "I just stopped playing the game you were in." She pulled her arm away from Julian's grip and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. Julian followed her, his shoes clicking a frantic, hollow rhythm on the linoleum as they retreated into the gray Gloucester sleet. The heavy doors closed, and the room seemed to exhale. Clara leaned her head against my shoulder. "That was the final inspection," she whispered. "Yeah," I said, looking at the closed doors. "The structures didn't hold." I walked over to my mother. She looked tired, but she reached out and took my hand. "He was always so loud, Nathan," she said softly. I thought the noise meant he was doing something important. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to the quiet." "It's okay, Mom," I said, kissing her forehead. "The quiet is where the real work gets done." As the last of the coffee was poured and the guests began to drift away, I realized that the poor brother was the only one in the family who was leaving that day with everything he actually needed. The parking lot of St. Jude's was nearly empty. The gray sleet had finally surrendered to a soft, hesitant snow that dusted the hoods of the few remaining cars. I stood by the door of my Ford Explorer, the engine idling with a familiar, mechanical hum. I leaned against the frame, breathing in the cold, sharp air of the Atlantic. It felt like the first full breath I had taken in 9 years. Clara came out a moment later, having finished helping my mother into the car with my aunt. She walked toward me, her boots crunching softly on the salted asphalt. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood beside me, looking out at the dimming horizon where the harbor lights were beginning to blink awake. "They're gone," she said. "Finally, they were gone a long time ago, Clara," I replied. Today was just the day the paperwork caught up with the reality. We drove home in a comfortable silence. The heater clicked and whirred, keeping the New England chill at bay. As we passed the North Corridor, I slowed down for a moment. I looked at the dark silhouette of the bridge, the one Elias Thorne had mentioned. It looked unremarkable to the casual observer, just a span of steel and concrete. But I knew what was beneath the surface. I knew the depth of the pilings and the strength of the reinforcement. It was a structure built to outlive the man who designed it. When we pulled into our driveway, the porch light of our restored farmhouse flicked on. It wasn't a mansion in the seaport or a villa on the vineyard. It was a house with a deep porch, a sturdy roof, and a garden that Clara had spent the summer tilling. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and old books. I sat at the kitchen table, the one I had built myself from reclaimed oak, and watched the snow accumulate on the windowsill. I thought about the word win. Sienna had used it like a weapon. Julian had used it like a drug. To them, winning was a point in time, a snapshot of a car, a ring, or a headline. But as I sat in the warmth of my home, I realized that winning isn't a destination. It's a frequency. It's the ability to sit in a room alone and not feel the urge to run. It's the knowledge that if the world's economy hiccuped tomorrow, your neighbors would still have a roof over their heads because you did your job right. My phone buzzed on the table. For a split second, I thought it might be Julian. Perhaps a final sting of venom or a desperate plea for a loan. I picked it up. It was an email from a young engineer I had mentored at the city office 3 years ago. "Hey Nate, just wanted to let you know I passed my pay exam today. I kept remembering what you said about the unseen details. Thanks for teaching me how to look at the bones first." I smiled and set the phone down. That was the real exit. That was the legacy that Julian's strategic architecture could never touch. "You're thinking again," Clara said, setting a mug of tea in front of me. "Just thinking about the math," I said. 9 years of being poor turned out to be the most expensive education I ever received. but the tuition was worth it. What did you learn? That you can't build a life on the things people see, I said, taking her hand. You have to build it on the things they don't. The years that followed the funeral were quiet, and that was exactly how we wanted them. Sterling Urban Works grew, not through aggressive acquisitions, but through a reputation for integrity. We didn't do disruptive projects, we did necessary ones. We fixed the foundations of the town, one brick at a time. Julian's firm eventually folded under the weight of its own debt. The mergers and exits he had bragged about were revealed to be a series of shell games that left a trail of angry investors and empty offices. Last I heard, he was consulting for a mid-level firm in another state, still chasing the next big surge, still looking for a room where no one knew his history. Sienna left him 2 years after the funeral. She didn't leave for a better man. She left because the stage had grown too small and the lights had dimmed. I heard she moved to the West Coast, reinventing herself once again, still running a race that has no finish line. Sometimes, when I'm walking through one of my buildings, I'll find a spot where the old brick meets the new steel. I'll run my hand over the seam, feeling the transition between what was discarded and what was saved. It reminds me that nothing is ever truly broken beyond repair if you're willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of reconstruction. If you're reading this, and you've ever felt like the smaller person in your own family story, if you've ever been told that your steady pace is a sign of a lack of ambition, I want you to remember Nathan Sterling. The world will always applaud the fireworks, it will always chase the flash and the noise. But when the smoke clears and the echoes die down, the only thing left standing is the stone. Build with stone, trust the quiet, and never let someone who is running a different race tell you that you're losing yours. There is more than one way to win, and usually, the best way is the one that allows you to sleep through the night without wondering if the roof is going to hold. I looked at Clara, then at the snow falling outside. I was 54 years old. I was an engineer. I was a husband. And finally, I was exactly who I was meant to be. The sound of the house was silent, but it was the silence of a structure that was perfectly in balance. If you like history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.